My name is Rasul Palmer, and I'm a member of the Kepler Institute. I'm also a senior at IPY, majoring in media science. I've been working with the Kepler Institute for over 12 years, as was mentioned, and to give some context of what the Kepler Institute is, Kepler is a community-based institution that has been operating within Indiana 16 years. Our mantra is community and self-mastery. And we empower community members through our myriad of social programs that fall into the 4E categories of entrepreneurship, education, environment, and empowerment. Our social programs include Food Initiative, a food share program for 5 years, New Media, which is a graphic design company that has been operating for over 10 years now, and Scarabee Consulting, our new consulting firm that helps build community through startup businesses and development. Another one of the programs I want to go in detail is the Democratizing Data Initiative, which I'm director of. With partnership with New America, the Democratizing Our Data is a program that aims to build intergenerational capacity in the field of data science and data analysis. So it can provide ability for grassroots institutions, the ability to effectively use data, public advocacy, and public policy. The core of the DoD project is an 8-week online workshop to teach young people the tool utilized in data analysis and data science. We completed an 8-week course a few days ago. People, the areas of which is our statistical language, that's for utilizing major data sets and analysis, GIS mapping, and the Tableau tool, which is used to build graphical data and communicate information easy to understand. We are planning our next 8-week session this upcoming October. The reason behind we started the Democratizing Our Data project is because the Kepler understands that data is a major driver in decision for public policy and institutional decision making. We also truly believe that whoever controls the data controls the narrative around the communities that data was gathered from. So we aim to ensure that communities have control over the narrative as to what the data is about, what the data speaks about the communities, have more sovereignty in how people learn about the communities and of their value. Lastly, I'll move on to how you can support. The next slide. How you can support. There are many ways you can support this project. One way is to, if you yourself or if you know anybody within the data field who's interested in working with young people and community and mentoring and teaching about different facets in the data field, please hit us up at data@kepler.org. Next is you can send us physical assets such as tools or direct us to any type of research you think we will find as useful to our program. And lastly, you can go to our website at kepler.org and simply hit the donate button. That's it.
Thank you, Rasul. Roxanne, in terms of the development lens, as well as Rasul, in terms of the authority over data that you talked about earlier in your presentation. Where do you see the trends going for data collection? What value do you see in the data that you're collecting today versus the data needed for the future? And so we can begin with, let's begin with you, Rasul, in terms of your authority over the data and who interprets that data. We have you on mute.
To answer that question, authority over that data, it's becoming more and more apparent, John pointed out, to gain more better understanding of like, who is it that resides over the data in the communities, like not acting, but acting with them, aiding this community members society and what is of value and what it is of importance as it relates to personal experience and what is their reality in those communities every day of their lives. Here at the Kepler Institute and the Democratizing Data Initiative, as a paramount perspective, we are trying to always bring forth that communities we're researching in are the fact, the primary, the raw data experience that you couldn't just get through numbers alone. And answer your second question about trends, my understanding about like big data is becoming more of a thing and like gaining massive amount of information about each individual lifestyle and how what their wants and desires and whatnot to build more integrated society around the Internet of Things, to help like nearly every object around it is connected to the internet in some form of fashion. So I feel like it's less about type and more about the different quantity of data you can gather about a person, individual's life, if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And I know you have a little bit of audio difficulty there, so we do want to apologize to all the participants. We know sometimes, even in this new age of technology, we can have some challenges. So we'll continue to work on that. But I think, Rasul, a little bit of what you mentioned before is something that I think is very important when it comes to data, that decisions should not be data-driven. I believe they should be data-informed. I believe, like you mentioned before, having context of the lived experience of communities and of individuals is important to be able to weigh into the data itself to make sure that you have a full-fledged perspective. So I think that's very important. I want to thank you for sharing that as well. Okay, so at this time, we do have a few questions for our participants. I'm sorry, Roxanne. Roxanne, do you want to weigh in on that question there?
Mute there. Okay, so I was just having a little trouble with my iPad for a second. So apologize for that.
Okay.
I would say in terms of, we're always trying to improve the quality of the data that we're collecting. And it is key that we have everybody participating in providing the data that is necessary. And often that's not necessarily the case, but it's part of the problem is that data is time consuming. To collect the data and gather the data and evaluate the data is very time consuming. And a lot of times we just don't have the resources as a community to keep track of the data. And I think that's where, as a community, in order to be better at implementing the various different tools that the city has and measuring how well we're doing, is simply just having the resources to gather and then analyze that data. And I believe we are lacking there as a community.
Thank you for sharing that, Roxanne. Okay, so at this time, we will open the floor to the questions that are coming in from our participants.
All right, Brian, this is Amy. So this question is for Rasul. Can you share a little more about your personal story and what got you interested in data? Are there any particular areas or community issues that Democratizing Data wants to focus on?
Okay, that's a long question. To answer the first part, story is in Indianapolis. Been working at the Kepler Institute for 10 years, as I mentioned in my presentation. What got me involved in data is like through STEM programs the Kepler Institute was hosting a couple years back. And I was it was called Open Source Initiative, where we was learning coding and programming languages such as HTML, JavaScript, and CSS and development. I've been doing the Institute for a couple of years. One idea was to start this initiative since data was becoming such a big thing, particularly big data, and for institutions, government, and not-for-profits, to start our own data initiative through our lens of understanding that communities should have an understanding of data science and data analysis to have more control about how data is interpreted and how the narrative is developed. One project focused on the Democratizing Data initiative was working on is we was trying to research on housing evictions in Indianapolis zip codes and demographics such as race, gender, and age within the Indianapolis counties. And that's one of the major programs we focus on. The different subjects we focus on is around education, entrepreneurship, like how many Black businesses have been closed due to introduction of COVID into society. If that answers the question, I believe.
I think it does. I think it does. And I think sharing your experience and how you got involved was very important to the question that was posed, but also some of the things that you're working on now. So that's great work, and we'll continue to chime in here a little bit more. Amy, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. So this may be for all of you to chime in on. Could the speakers address data on governance? I would be interested in hearing about examples of equitable resident-based leadership, including vis-a-vis the community investment district model.
Roxanne, would you like to take a run at that one first?
Yeah, so if you could, so I know I read that earlier, and when you talk about data on governance, so, and I get, what I understand is the leadership within the community. We really, as far as I know, there's nothing, at least in the city, that where we're gathering data as to the leadership throughout the community that is diverse.
How about the governance of the community improvement district, the board of directors who oversee maybe a district? Is there?
Oh, on a community, well, I'm seeing community investment district versus a community improvement district. So maybe they're referring to community improvement districts, which is something that we have here in Kansas City. And the way the statute works within a community improvement district in the state of Missouri, you have to be, depending on the type of district, you have to live within the district. And sometimes those districts are very small. And there may not be diversity within that district. Also, many of them are controlled by the property owners and those who own property within the district. And so there may not be a level of diversity in that regard on some of our community improvement districts. So I think what threw me off there was the comment or the reference to community investment district. But there's nothing that that Kansas City has a policy on or that it's set out in the statute. It's really those who are governing or running that, the property owners in the district,
Sure.
and depending on how it is established.
Sure. So in Missouri, we know that there are special business districts and there are different types of business districts, community improvement district being one of those. So that's a good point there in terms of clarification. Anybody else want to answer that question? John, you want to take a run at that one?
Yeah, I think that's something that we've seen here locally in St. Louis that's been really helpful for one of these kind of hyper-local districts, be they SIDS, BIDs, SBDs, things like that, or making sure that you're able to work with people who are residents of the community to get them involved onto these boards of directors and try to see what you can do to make sure that that board of directors is as representative of the people that live and work in that area as possible. And a lot of times there's this kind of just default mindset that we fall into that says, you know what, we need to get all the big stakeholders at the table. We need to move them along and figure out kind of just what their needs are and how can we make them happy. And when that happens, the neighbors feel like they get left behind. So I'm a big fan of having this kind of dual board approach where you have one that's the actual governing board of the organization that is representative of the people that live, work, and play there, and another one that's kind of this advisory group of the stakeholders, right? The people that are traditionally the board members that get brought along to the table. And as we know, there's a lot of challenges with that. There's commitment issues. These are people that are, pouring their heart and souls into their small businesses. And while they really want to help, they might not necessarily have time to dedicate to governing structures, but still want to be involved. Having them in an advisory role allows them to participate in the process, allows them to have a say in what's going on, but also respects the character of the neighborhood and respects the neighbors and the people that live there. So that's something that I see that's been very useful and very impactful and effective. And it's the kind of thing that you can definitely get a lot of pushback from when people say, why are you shutting me out? Why are you doing this? Why are you involving people that, quote, don't know anything about how this works and things like that? And I would encourage you to not underestimate people. Make sure that you're bringing folks to the table that are competent, that know what's going on. So if there's a local neighborhood organization or local community development corporation at the neighborhood level that can help assist you in trying to figure out who should be part of this board, talk to them. Build these connections and see what you can do to make sure that the boards and the governance structures locally are representative, because that's how you're going to get equity out of these organizations.
All right, thank you, Roxanne and John on that. Amy, next question we have.
Yes, the next one's for Jenny. You have made a lot of progress on your diversity initiatives. However, given the current social unrest, do you think that more could be done given your current success in your initiatives?
Oh, for sure. That's one thing that I think that we do a great job of. We constantly are looking at things, changing things. If things aren't working, we definitely are going to look at ways to make improvements. With recent, with the recent riots that were going on, I was very proud of our Diversity Inclusion Council. They immediately put together a panel of 5 of our Black associates, and they spoke on what it was like to be Black in America. And it was a great conference, a great setting for our associates to hear, ask questions, and to talk about how we can be part of the change. And we're going to have another session, a panel discussion in October. It's just kind of part 2 of our racial inequalities. So we definitely are listening and looking at ways that we can continue to improve diversity inclusion at Duke Realty. I think it's always changing, and I think there's always things that we could do better and to do different. And so that's a great thing about Duke Realty, is that we're willing to make those changes.
And let me just follow up briefly. In terms of what you have seen from some of your colleagues and other businesses through the Society of Human Resource Management, what are they talking about in terms of game-changing work? Just kind of briefly, what is happening in terms of that discussion?
I would say right now is what I see and what I hear is really getting more involved with our diverse associates in our organization, asking them what they want, what they see we're doing well, what improvements we can do. Because I think a lot of times, I think someone, maybe John may have said it, a lot of times, organizations or companies are putting all these great programs in place and doing these great things, but is it really hitting the nail on the head? I mean, our associates, our diverse associates, are they happy with that? Is it really an added value? And so to be honest, we have never really asked. I mean, we've done all these great things, and we have engagement surveys and things like that. And we usually score very high on our engagement surveys and diversity inclusion. But to actually have a group together and say, okay, what's working, what's not working, what should we be doing differently? So that's something that I hear a lot of companies doing today.
All right. Thank you for that. Okay, Amy, we have another question.
Sure. So can Roxanne, if she pops on, expand upon who is analyzing the data for economic cost-benefit analyses of incentives? Is it City Hall, EDC, et cetera? And then per John's comment, are there opportunities to validate the data through community discussion, and how can one get involved in this process?
Sure. So the data is collected in various ways. And in some cases, when you talk about cost benefit analysis, in some cases, the city will hire, or really it's the developer pays for it, but it's engaged by the city or through what is called our Economic Development Corporation of Kansas City, Missouri, a third-party analyst that will review the metrics of the project and look at various different, and usually they're tracking not really the racial equity and diversity of a particular project, and how that may have an impact on the community in that regard, but really they're looking at the metrics related to the costs of delivering services to a particular project, and also the benefits to the various different taxing jurisdictions. So the cost benefit analysis is fairly limited in the data that it does collect. And again, like I said, it's typically a third party that's doing that. When you ask if there's an opportunity for others to get involved in that process and comment on that, obviously there's always the public engagement portion when we're utilizing any of these economic development incentive tools. But to truly get more substantive hands-on with that, I would say, reach out to the Economic Development Corporation of Kansas City. Would be my recommendation if there's anybody that's interested in helping to gather data. That would be my suggestion.
And John Roxon talked about it, but it seemed like based on the question that was asked, how do people, particularly people of color, how do they get involved in this decision-making process? Let's say if it's a community improvement district that runs through a certain neighborhood. What would be your thoughts or suggestions about how these governing bodies can get people of color included, and people who want to get involved, how should they go about doing that?
I think a lot of it kind of speaks to this really strong amount of just kind of personal ethos that a lot of people have in this country, where there's this kind of desire to get involved with something, but you're never really sure where to start. And a lot of that just kind of stems from overcoming a lot of mental barriers as far as how you think the world is operating. And for a lot of people, especially residents and neighbors, they have this idea that, there's all these developers and there's all these people that are, walking around with their fancy degrees, using lots of language and terms that I'm not going to be familiar with, and I'm not sure if I'm really going to be, comfortable stepping into this kind of environment. But the reality of the situation is, when organizations are looking for people to help serve on resident advisory committees or boards of directors and things like that, they're going to people they know. They're going to people who they can vouch for and say, hey, I know this person. I think they would be a really, really, really good choice for this. And I think we should reach out to them and see if they're interested. So I think the biggest thing is just trying to do what you can to get involved in efforts locally. And whatever that looks like, if you have a neighborhood organization or a community development corporation or somebody that's working locally, and just reach out and talk to the people that are part of this. And don't be afraid to send an email to an executive director and say, hey, I'm a really big fan of the work that you're doing. I want to see if there's anything that I could help lend to these efforts. And sit down and have a cup of coffee with people, because odds are they're going to be really happy to make that kind of connection. Of course, socially distanced, or whenever COVID is over, or whatever happens, or the Zoom virtual cup of coffee kind of thing that's going on right now, whatever that looks like. Don't be afraid to step out of your shell a little bit. And one of the hardest things about this is that we like to do things that are comfortable to us. We like doing things that are familiar and feel good and spark joy, right? So what do we do when we're in these situations where you feel like you're stepping outside of that a little bit? And the answer, at least my experience, has been to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable, and know that the only way that you're really going to grow and change and be able to have additional experiences that you can blend into the work of others is to say, it's going to be a little uncomfortable at first. I recognize that this is a brand new sandbox with new kids, and I'm not necessarily sure what the games are or what the rules are or anything like that. And that'll all go away once you start getting involved. So pick up the phone, send an email, start getting to know the people that are doing the work that you want to get involved in, and take it from there. That's how people end up on those names when somebody who's an elected official says, hey, I need people that can be on this committee for this thing. Who do you recommend? If they don't know you, they're never going to recommend you for it. They're not going to say, hey, I seen this guy that lives a few houses down. He seems all right. Why don't you call him? That's not going to fly. You got to get out there a little bit, kick yourself in the butt to maybe be a little bit more extroverted than you're comfortable with until you get comfortable.
All right, very good. We've got about 15 minutes before we begin our closing remarks. So I think, Amy, we got a couple more questions we want to get to pretty quick.
Yeah, so there's a couple that talk a little bit about the pandemic and census together, so I might combine those, and whoever wants to respond can do that. So how does the impact of COVID-19 impact this process? Is there anything being done to collect current census? And then historically, obviously, low-income renters have been difficult to collect data on, but they're the most vulnerable groups. What can we do to better track these folks that are falling through the cracks?
Rasul, you mentioned before doing some work on tenant evictions. How about we take the latter part of that question about tenants in terms of being able to track them? What are your thoughts on that?
How to track them? There are myriad ways to do that. One is probably have people that actually have social capital and relationships with the community and the community question. Guys,
What we're going to do is if you can just put your video, stop the video, and then answer it. I think that'll give you some more bandwidth there.
Okay, does that help?
Yeah, let's go. That sounds good.
Okay. Where I left off is one possible idea is to build relationships with community members who have good social capital with the community at question. Actually have relationships with the people that is of concern for the census and these vulnerable groups and demographics. That actually, because frankly speaking, a lot of these demographics don't necessarily trust these institutions to gather this information regardless of reason. For the census or for any other project, because these communities are used to these type of things happening and never gain any benefit from it, or actually gain some detriment from it. And so that's one idea I have, is to build actual genuine relationship with communities at hand. And frankly, there's no quick, easy solution if that's what you're looking for. It's too many particular damages that's been going on for years, for decades in these communities. And so it will probably take a long human relationship type of fixing to.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because again, having relationships with people who live in the neighborhood to have that credibility. There's a term that came out of Drexel University called the street corner thesis, which means that you have to really engage those individuals who really know the people who live there and who are a part of that community. So building those bridges early on, not when you need the data, but having an ongoing relationship is very important. Regarding the first part of the question about the pandemic and the challenges around census, John, I think you're probably closely familiar with the census data. Just briefly, what are your thoughts? And we have a couple other questions before we have to wrap up here.
Well, I think everything that Rasul said kind of just hits the nail on the head. We have a lot of communities that are very challenging to get accurate counts for. And as we all know, that these are the numbers that determine how legislative districts are drawn. They determine where money goes that comes from the federal and state governments. It determines so much. And there's a tremendous amount of distrust and in these communities and in these data and everything else that kind of comes as part of it. That's why things like turnout in local elections are equity indicators, because people in disenfranchised communities have said it doesn't matter who I vote for, my life doesn't change at all despite all the promises these people come out and make. If your life gets better, good for you, but it doesn't really do anything for me. And I think that speaks a lot to a really substantial lack of trust in public institutions and in elected officials and in anybody who doesn't really just like live right on your block, who you know and can see all the time and have that kind of accountability. Because if they're doing something you don't like, you could call them out. It's not always easy to go ahead and do that somewhere else. So when we look at the census data, this is part of why we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt and realize that in some cases, especially when we're looking at the American Community Survey data, especially the one-year estimates, we can see margins of error that are just like wildly insane, to the point where you can look at this and say, I don't even know if I can use this or not. And that's why it's important to frame data in a way that you're saying, I am asking a question based on the findings that I have. Hopefully through dialogue and conversation and this kind of street corner thesis mentality, you can put that data into perspective a little bit more, you can refine it a little bit better, and you can't necessarily take all of it at face value. You have to look at it and say, this is a starting point for us to kind of help understand what's going on. Now we have to go to the community, build trust, build relationships, and be able to put this stuff in perspective and see what the census got right and what they didn't get right. When it comes to evictions specifically, it's so hard. And depending on what city you work in, there may be resources available to help you put these sorts of things into context. There's two types of evictions. There's formal evictions that go through the court system and a judge rules and says, yeah, you got to get out of the house. And then there's informal evictions, which are nearly impossible to track, and no one's figured out a way to do it yet. And those are things where the landlord says, you know what, you just got to go. And that's the end of it. Or they say, I'm going to be doing a bunch of renovations, so I can't renew your lease. You got to go. Or I'm increasing the rent by a substantial amount that's a lot more than you thought it was going to be, so you got to go. Things like that. So it's a really, really challenging thing to track. I would encourage everyone to look at the Eviction Lab website run by Dr. Matthew Desmond at evictionlab.org. Talk to people in your local community who do eviction work. There may be legal organizations that are nonprofit who specialize in this sort of thing. There may be local housing security and housing advocacy groups that can help you, homeless prevention groups that can help put some of this into context, because not all of it's going to be readily available. Like, these are not necessarily data sets you can just go to a website and click and download and understand it. And even if there's a data portal and lots of visualizations, it may be telling a really incomplete version of the full story.
Hey, John. We'll provide those resources that John referenced as well on the ULI website. We'll talk about that when we wrap up. We have about 10 minutes, so we want to get through these few remaining questions. So, Amy?
Sure. Would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on how to navigate the data analysis, both with an equity lens when the ones that are maybe asking for the data are not maybe interested in it, or how do you combat the bias that may be inherent in the data collection process and analysis?
Okay. Jenny, if I can maybe segue to you, and again, we don't want to, just your thoughts in terms of, again, what gets measured gets improved. What are your thoughts on that in terms of, and again, we know that a spectrum along racial lines, everybody's at a different level in terms of the spectrum, but in terms of any bias and those kind of things, what are your thoughts in terms of measurements and making interventions where needed to stay on task with the goals at Duke Realty?
Well, if you're talking about like in pay equity, that's one reason why we put the 4 steps in place where we're analyzing it 4 different times to make sure that if we have a problem or we see something that's off, that we can make that correction. And we started that in 2015, but we really didn't get good at it until probably last year where we put those 4 stops in place. And so it was nice to see this year that some of the people that were falling below diverse people or women, that they were no longer on that list. And there's lots of reasons why someone might fall below a midpoint salary band or whatever, but it's just nice that we have those 4 points in place, because it allows us, to remove the bias and say, you know what, this is why we put this program in place. These people should be at, at this level, and if they're not, we move them. And so we've been fortunate enough to do that. Does that help answer it?
It does, yes. Okay, Amy, any other questions, or if anybody else wants to chime in there?
I'll close with this last one. So sharing data is crucial, but graphs and charts can lose people quickly. Has anyone explored the visualization of data, either in the context of maps, GIS tools, or anything else?
John, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that. And this is something where there's a couple different challenges to it. One is that, a lot of us are visual learners and they like to see what exactly it is that's going on in a way that makes sense beyond just kind of a written narrative. But I feel like at the same time, charts and graphs really only mean so much as the perspective of the data that's going into it. So it's important to have a little bit of narrative that talks about this and say, okay, I'm not just going to give you a chart or a map or a piece of information. I'm going to give you a little bit about what puts it in context and why this matters and what's different, or maybe how it compares to other places, so that way people have a good idea as far as what it is. And that means speaking to lots of different kinds of data visualization. So it could be maps or storyboards or something that's interactive on a website or something that's a piece of paper that's handed out. it has to speak a lot to making sure that whatever it is that you're doing, you don't want to dumb things down, but you want to use layman's terms that are easy for people to understand. And that's a big part of making sure that you understand what you're talking about, is being able to explain it in a way that's really universally translatable. And you don't want to spend a whole lot of time explaining with glossaries of terms and things like that. You're just going to lose even more people. So whatever kind of visual aid you have, make sure that there's something to accompany it to put it into perspective, and make sure that it makes sense. And that if you could just hand this to your neighbor and say, hey, you don't know anything about this, but if I give you this, does this kind of make sense to you? And kind of start with that mentality. The other part of it is that when you're using visual aids, make sure that there's a level of cultural competency that goes into it. So for instance, if you're talking a very simple demographic map and you're saying which percentage of a census tract is African American, you don't want that number to be represented by the color red. You know, that's a color that we associate with danger. I don't like this, stay away, don't go here. Choose something else. And I know that's kind of an explicit example that might be a little bit obvious, but it could be surprising the amount of data visualizations I've seen out there that just make you go, yikes, how did you get away with this without getting fired? Like, it happens. So cultural competency is important. Making sure that you're able to translate your message in an easy to understand way makes sense, and understanding your audience to understand exactly what it is that they'd be comfortable looking at and what they'd be comfortable consuming.
Great point. Rasul, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yes. To answer that question, instead of visualization, being able to communicate to the demographic group of people or cultural understanding you're dealing with is different than just dumbing it down. Being good at communication is not dumbing it down. We don't necessarily want to insult people's intelligence. It's just that whatever they don't know, they don't know. And it's your responsibility to be able, it's your responsibility to be able to figure out the best way to communicate your information to the community at hand. That answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Did I break up in there? Did I break
Yeah.
up there?
No, you're good. You're okay. You're okay. I think Amy sent one last question in, and I think it may be part for me to answer, but the question is, how do we get our leaders to care about equity data, and why is it important? And again, I like to say that what can be measured can be changed, or you can make improvements upon it, but if you don't have the data, it's hard to make any kind of changes. And I think we see a lot of that with some of the glittering generalities, is what I would call it, and that's a term that they use in marketing, about Black Lives Matter, for example. We saw a lot of public statements being issued by companies and institutions around the country about what they were going to do and how they were going to do things. But the problem is, who's evaluating that to ensure that they're being held accountable and not just benefiting from publicity of tragedy. So again, I think it's important for there to be what we call anti-racist. Those are people who are champions of really trying to address racial disparities. It's not important, or it's not just enough to be non-racist. Anybody can say that they're non-racist. The question is, what are you doing actively to make a difference and to make a change? And again, for any organization to measure success, you have to have those racial disparities and those outcomes and figure out what the goals are. And I think a lot of it has to do with organizations in terms of your organizational strategic plan, and how do you carry about doing your work? What are your values as an organization? It's very good to have in your office setting your mission statement, your vision, and your values. But the question that I would have is, how do you execute, and what is the story? What is your success in doing this? So again, I think these things are important for all of us to think about as we go forward. Again, this is about analysis. And what I would like to do now is turn it back over to Amy, who will talk about our third leg on this journey around race, land use, and leadership.
Awesome. Thank you again to our panelists and our moderator. I know I gained a broader understanding of what and how data is used to shape the narrative and the future of the equity conversation. And I hope you all have some beneficial takeaways, some links to follow, and contacts. We will be sending a follow-up email with a link to a brief survey. I do hope you take the time to provide us your feedback so we can continually learn and improve on these types of engagements. Also, as a reminder, a recording of this session will be posted on the WLI Summit website, along with the slides from our panelists today. I do invite you to join us for our last conversation in this series, focusing around action. We will discuss how we will take what we learned thus far and actually turn it into actionable items. We also share examples of those making meaningful change in our communities, so keep an eye out for email blasts and visit our website in the coming weeks to register. And again, this will be on October 21st, same time, 3:30 p.m. Central Time. Again, it has been my sincere pleasure and honor to host this important conversation and share these resources to help strengthen our resolve on this journey together. With that, I wish you good afternoon and good night.